Warm up. Edelman Trust Barometer 2016, Confronting the Inequality of Trust. I'm delighted to be joined here by President and CEO of Edelman, Richard Edelman, Vice Chairman of Arabesque Partners, and founder and former Executive Director of the United Nations Global Compact, Georg Kell, and of course, Senator Mark Warner of Virginia. And I'll introduce you each with a little bit more pomp and circumstance in a couple of minutes. Tonight, we will hear from Richard regarding the results of the 2016 Edelman Trust Barometer, and then Georg and Senator Warner will come to stage and we'll sit here to discuss the implications of the widening trust gap around the world. If you ever want to know just how good Edelman is, you have to read the first sentence in the Financial Times about this opinion survey, which happens to be true, but it also, you couldn't have written it better yourself. And so it's, quote, opinion surveys float by and disappear. Every now and then one lands with a splash because it seems to explain something important. And that's really why we're gathered here this evening, because it truly does explain something important. The annual Edelman Trust Barometer looks at reputations of business, government, and other institutions, and as the FT says, this year has come up with a striking opinion gap between informed people at the top and the rest of the population. Informed public, Richard, if I've got this right, represents about 25% of global GDP, and college educated, and then the rest of the population, 85%. Of population, more or less, but you'll go into more of that detail with us. In its 16-year history, the Edelman Trust Barometer has grown from a survey conducted in a handful of countries to a global measurement that includes responses from over 33,000 participants in 25 countries, helping businesses, governments, NGOs, and media track perspectives of trust worldwide. Reports in overall improvement in trust levels, and that's interesting, that's one of the interesting stories here that Richard will go into, unfortunately have been overshadowed by a focus on the widening trust gap between elites and the general public. Last week, Mr. Kell wrote an article in the Huffington Post highlighting the challenge awaiting our leaders. In it, he noted that, quote, to change the tide, the journey toward reinventing governments, rebuilding trust, and encouraging inclusive social consensus must start with the will of the people to make public institutions work. We'll talk some about that. We'll also talk about the role of government where trust levels aren't great, and the role of business where trust levels are, I think, at an all-time high in your 16-year barometer, which is very interesting. So let me just quickly introduce three speakers and then hand to Richard Edelman to brief us on the report, and then the three will join me on stage for a conversation among ourselves and then with the audience. Richard is president and CEO of Edelman, the largest independently owned PR firm in the world, communications marketing firm in the world. Richard is one of the most original and far-sighted thinkers I know. He's a thought leader in the industry and is consistently listed among the top 25 experts on corporate trust. He's also a fierce competitor on the tennis court, and when you're hiking up a mountain with him, just make sure you don't actually have to keep up to him. But I think that reflects well on the competitive spirit he brings to his clients. We are grateful to have him on the Council's Board of Directors and on our International Advisory Board. Georg Kell is Vice Chairman of Arabesque Partners, the world's first ESG quant fund that combines sustainability priorities with quantitative analysis. He was the founding executive director of the United Nations Global Compact, the world's largest voluntary corporate sustainability initiative. Among his many accolades, he has been listed among the 100 most influential in business ethics every year since 2011. Prior to serving in the Senate, Senator Mark Warner was governor of Virginia and spent 20 years as a business and technology leader. He co-founded the company that became Nextel, which allowed him to invest in hundreds of startup technology companies. He's also a real intellectual power on the Hill, and he has incredibly interesting ideas, on the future of work and many other things. When he left the governor's office in 2006, Virginia was ranked as the best state for business, the best managed state, and the best state in which to receive a public education. He just co-chaired one of our most important reports last year for our Global Energy Center on the geopolitics of energy after the major changes in the American energy posture. He serves on the Senate Finance, Banking, Budget, and Intelligence Committees and has worked to establish himself as a bipartisan leader, increasing government performance and accountability and promoting private sector innovation and job creation. We're honored to have such a variety of experiences and depth on this panel and anticipate a rich discussion, I hope provocative discussion, because one thing is actually diagnosing what's going on through the trust barometer, and then the more difficult thing is deciding what to do about it. Richard, the floor is yours.
Basketball games. You had pity. Okay, so I'm going to quickly go through the data from this year. The survey sample is important because it considers people who are informed publics who are in the top 15% of income. In other words, people who make $75,000 plus, people who have college plus education, and are media attentives, media 4 times a day, or 4 media a day, versus the mass population, which is all other. So if you think about it, it's sort of 3 classes of people. It's everybody, it's the people at the top, and then the other 85%. So here's what we found. In fact, the total numbers for informed elites are at the highest level we've seen in the 16 years we've been doing this study. And it's true of trust in the highest institution, which is NGOs. Second is business. Third is media. Fourth is government. Let me just give you a long view of those institutions. NGOs started very high in Europe, came up in the US, and most recently have become high in Asia Pacific. Business started out really badly in our survey, 2001, because the dot-com implosion. Business rallied. Then business went terribly backwards in 2008, 2009, as you might expect. Went to 4th. And then business has risen substantially over the last 7 years to be at its peak of ever for our statistics. Media is in a long, slow descent with occasional rebounds for what we call the big house, meaning the big house including Facebook and others that which are social. And so media's had a bit of a renaissance, but media is in a slow descent. And government was the savior in 2008, 2009, and has gradually fallen apart. Started in the West, started in the US, started in Western Europe, and now this is spread to even much lower numbers than we've ever seen in markets such as South Africa, Argentina, etc., countries where government is seen as utterly hopeless. So the government numbers are sinking. So what I want to show you is a 28-country list of what we call the trust index. It is the average trust score for each of the 4 institutions of business, media, government, NGOs. And so what you'll observe between 2015 and 2016 is a swelling of the numbers at the blue, that's the top, in other words, 60% plus, a more or less even some swelling in the middle, and a diminution of those so-called distruster countries 50 or below. So that's the math. Now, take a look at the contrast to that which is considered mass population and that which is general population. So general population is all, mass population is bottom 85, elites are top. It's as if the world is looking at a telescope through 2 different ends. In short, 2/3 of the countries and the mass population are distruster. And it's a complete opposite of the elites. So the elites think the world's really pretty good, and the mass thinks the world is pretty bad. That's sort of the general point of this slide. Not a single European country in the truster category, except for, and every so-called truster country left in the mass population is in Asia Pacific, most of them not in the democratic column, or quasi-democratic. India being the exception to that rule. So it's an accelerating problem. In other words, this started in 2010 and has grown. It's also a global phenomenon. Don't kid yourself, this is not just an American and a British problem or a French problem. In other words, the three places we sort of think of Le Pen or Corbyn or ourselves with Trump. It's also true in India, it's true in Mexico, etc. This gap issue. It is somewhat linked to Gini coefficient, but again, not completely, not totally. Income inequality, which is what the Gini coefficient captures, shows this problem even as a larger problem. So remember I told you that we were talking about the informed elites? So this is a relationship between the top 25% of people in our survey and income, and the bottom 25. The gap in the United States moves from 19 points to 31 points. Okay? The 15 versus the 85. This is the 25 versus the 25, 31 points. When we did this survey on the 1% and the bottom 10%, it's over 40. So it's totally related to income, this perception of trust in institutions. And the result of it is that the mass population is substantially less optimistic about its future. They don't necessarily think they're going to have as good jobs. They don't think their kids are going to be better off than they are, etc. So here's the big hypothesis. I don't know how many of you were government majors, but I was. We had to read a book called Power Elite by C. Wright Mills, and it was this notion of, the people who were at the top, more or less, had the power, had the authority, had the influence. And the people in the bottom part said, okay, that's fine because, more or less they know more than we do. They have better information. They're kind of looking out for us. And maybe someday I'll be one of them. Well, all of those are now seen as myths. In fact, more or less, I, being in the mass population, have as much influence, as much information as anybody else because I read the internet. I'm just making a joke. And I get information from my friends. And they're telling me everything I need to know. Also, for sure, I'm not going to get up to where those elite people are because there's no ability to move up in the world anymore. And by the way, I'm mad as hell. And I'm not going to take it anymore. We've heard this in a movie. In fact, we might see it tonight as another movie. But our hypothesis is that influence and authority have split. And the authority may still rest with the elites, but the influence, as a function of cell phones, as a function of social networks, etc., is now with us. And the predominant way we talk is horizontally to each other, not believing the top down. So the detaching of authority and influence is a significant development. Therefore, why do we say these things? Well, take a look at who the mass population believes. They believe people like themselves. The number one source is an academic and a technical expert. That's been so for years, but the new tie is with a person like you. And it's more profound in more skeptical markets, such as Germany. 7 points ahead of anybody else. And double government officials and double CEOs. So they trust people like themselves. Also, they believe peer-driven media, this world of self-reference. In short, I believe that which is search and social, and I watch Fox because I'm a person who believes in what I hear on TV if it believes and if it agrees with me. So it's a world of self-reference. The elites, newspapers, magazines first, and then all other. So again, through the different ends of the telescope. Business versus government. Here we are in the seat of government in America. I just want you to see this as a bit of an eye chart, but look at the gaps in trust in so many countries. We're talking about 30, 40, 50-point gaps in the developing markets. This is a new phenomenon over the last 3 or 4 years. The disgust with government in developing markets is huge. Business has no choice in a certain way but to lead in those markets. It's also profound in the US and elsewhere. What's happened with business that's allowed businesses' trust to rally? In part, it is the rebound of financial services. Financial services was dragging down the reputation of all business, and Mark had to sit through many endless hearings in 08, 09, and 10 with banks. Well, banks have rallied. And not true in every market, still 30% in Germany, but in the US it's now over 50. In fact, among the elites, this is an interesting stat, among the elites, banks are 70% trusted. In the mass population, it's only 50. But tech has actually rebounded from a 2-year reversal because of privacy and security. And so more or less, we don't have something dragging it down anymore, which was banks. Also a key point, and Mark's going to talk about this in his remarks, business is most trusted to keep pace with innovation. And it's the first time we've seen business more trusted than NGOs in any of the questions we've ever asked. So this is significant. NGOs are seen as a good guard against, overstretch, but business is going to lead in this, and it's a huge gap with government. We're talking about 20, 30 points difference. Most people also now have absorbed a truth, which is that business can make money and also act in a way that improves the economic and social conditions in the country. That's something very new. And also, they want CEOs to lead. They expect CEOs first to talk about societal issues, what they're doing to, help on youth unemployment or whatever, and then about financial results. They also want to know who CEOs are. Here's a shocking statistic. More than half of Americans cannot name a single CEO. I repeat, more than half of the general population in America cannot name a single CEO. When they name a CEO, it is Zuckerberg, Gates, or the late Steve Jobs. It's all tech people. Steve Jobs is alive and well because of the movies, but he's alive and well because of the products. Tech CEOs are the only ones who stand up and talk because they front their products. Everybody else is talking to Wall Street. You can't like someone unless you know them. You can't trust someone if it's a class. If CEOs are a class, we're doomed. They have to get up and talk. Also, CEOs can't do it themselves. As you saw, only 45% of people trust CEOs, partly because they don't know who they are. But employees are most trusted, not just about issues related to them, what they get paid and all this, but even on financial or operational results. Employees are most trusted. That's because people talk horizontally. They talk to each other. It's not a top-down thing anymore. So here's the hypothesis. Trust has to be the thing standing that glues between authority and influence. And we have to make trust work. And so basically, we'll talk about that on the panel, but I think I've done enough of slides. I think it's Fred time. You ready? Ready. Let's go, Coach. Mark.
So why don't, if you don't mind, Richard, I think I'll start with our 2 other panelists who have been watching your presentation, then I'll come back to you. But I'd like to start with Senator Warner. As you watch this presentation, what does it mean for you as a politician, but what does it mean also from the standpoint of a former business leader? So as you look at this, what are the most important takeaways from both of those hats that you've worn?
A couple quick things. One, thank you for having me back. It's always great to be back at the Atlantic Council. And Richard, again, great job. I'm not fully surprised at this. I'm a little surprised that business came out as well as it did, actually. We've talked before. I've got a couple of posits I might make slightly different. One, I think as important as income inequality is, what is equally important in terms of what policymakers need to address is income insecurity. And I think that in certain ways, if it was just income inequality, I don't think you'd see the support for Mr. Trump. I think there are fundamental changes going on in capitalism that as a policymaker and as a former business guy, I'm concerned about. I almost fear that the focus on short-termism, the focus on quarterly results over long-term value creation is creating a lot of this income, both inequality and insecurity. And my hope would be that out of this, particularly for business leaders, we can come with some policy ideas that might help rebalance the willingness of business leaders to invest in their human capital, not make that the most disposable item in their agenda, and in a way do it so that we can complement what is already happening in the marketplace as more and more groups with sustainability councils or the B Corp movement or the Paul Tudor Jones with Just Capital. As we kind of do name and shame, can we also kind of juice that effort a little bit with actually policy predictions or policy objectives that I'd love to discuss later in the conversation. But I think for policymakers, if we, and it's playing out a little bit, you could argue in our elections right now, the notional idea that the kind of unfettered hand of the market is going to fix things or massive redistribution are going to fix things seems to be where at least a couple of the candidates are headed, and I'm not sure that's the exact right future that I'd like to see take place, at least in this country.
So as you look at those numbers up there, do they explain the Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders phenomena?
I think people are extraordinarily frustrated. I think they have seen, in our country particularly, the gridlock in Washington. There's that frustration. Combine that frustration with the sense, and we were talking about this earlier, I think the whole notion of work is fundamentally changing. More and more work is being disaggregated and broken up into small, discrete tasks that are in effect being bid out on a market basis. That's the so-called gig or on-demand economy, which has got some wonderful, that's the Uber drivers and the Airbnb hosts, as long as the handies and the TaskRabbits and the others. That offers a great opportunities around freedom and flexibility, but there's no social contract there. And you combine that, and the one thing I was a little surprised at is, I think within a lot of traditional businesses, since we all know that the idea of you're going to go to work for the same company for 20 years and work on the line, and you may not get rich, but you're going to get a pension, and you're going to put your kids through school, and you're going to be all right, those jobs are disappearing. And unless we can find a way to re-incent, and I hope that is not the first signs of the revolution happening out there, that we could have a very, very choppy time.
Mm-hmm. Georg, as you look at this presentation, what do you see in it that concerns you most? What jumps out at you?
Well, I still believe that a focused, efficient, effective government can play a critically important role in our communities, and that unfortunately the trust level in that enterprise is going down, and on top of that, we now have at least in the United States, we are at an all-time low as a percent of our GDP are spending on things like education, infrastructure, research, things that as a business guy I would invest in. But over the last decade, we're on a downward path, so we've got this self-fulfilling prophecy as, outside of entitlements, the discretionary part of government that actually helps empower people keeps getting shrunk. That then reinforces the thing, well, it doesn't work. Right. And it just almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Your answer to the...
No, first, let me say I have been following the Edelman Trust Barometer from its very inception. I always found it extremely timely, a snapshot of what's going on around the world, very important with the different regional and country specifics. This year's findings, I find one extremely encouraging sign, and that is the silent revolution of business taking on wider responsibility is paying off at some level. You know, it is creating trust, and it makes sense to reposition purpose, to restate the importance of values, to promote engagement, and I think that explains some of the upturn of the higher trust in business, which may surprise many, but it actually is a silent revolution that has been going on for over a decade now and is now gaining pace. And the same is now spilling over into the financial world, where it's understood that companies that focus on material sustainability also outperform those which do not. So we are talking here really about a fairly big transformation from within. It's still ongoing and has not yet transformed overall, but it's sufficiently advanced to show impact. What really worries me this year, is the low trust in governments. As the senator said, you know, we need certain public services, public goods, which are essential. It's a long-term investment. And if that doesn't function anymore, then we have a big problem at hand. You know? And that is, as Richard outlined, not just here in the US, it's a global phenomenon. And low trust in public institutions has many sources, and the Trust Barometer outlined some of them. But I think it should be a wake-up call, because it will undermine the very system that enables business to grow and to expand. For example, at the global level, nobody talks about multilateral trade anymore and the rule-based approach to integration. We all know, you know, almost a race to bilateral and strategic competition at the national level. Very dangerous, very dangerous. We're hollowing out the very system that has been enabling the expansion of trade and investment, which brought all the benefits in many regards, but also the many challenges. Support for openness is dwindling. Populism is on the rise. I'm just back from a trip in Europe in various countries. I was shocked, even the traditional southern Bavaria, where I was born. I hear voices I didn't think existed anymore. Have we forgotten history? It's coming back. Obviously, the refugee crisis there is the big thing. But I see many dark clouds on the governance side. I do believe the basic thesis says something very important. We live in a challenging governance transformation. We are moving into a new way of how work looks like, how security looks like. We move into something where we have to live with interdependence. Yet, you know, there's a cultural struggle going on now of different tribes coming back again, claiming all sorts of popular opinions on the extremes, which makes it increasingly difficult to form consensus and dialogue. And maybe the digital empowerment of people has accelerated that. Mm-hmm. It certainly has. There's this time frame. The senator mentioned the scourge of short-termism. It's also reflected probably in public opinion and how quickly things can be mobilized. So I think it's very worrisome. So my advice to business leaders is take this serious and look what the recommendations have consistently been in the Trust Barometer. You know, values, engagement, community work, but also don't just bash governments and public institutions, right, but rather see that how we can restore trust in public institutions. Now we need kind of corporate leadership that recognizes the importance of the public service. That would be my conclusion from it. But very worrisome.
Before we go to that, because I want to go to Richard on this question of corporate leadership, from both of your standpoints, Senator Warner and Georg, what's the most important thing government has to do to get back trust, to win back trust? I think for a lot of us, it's interesting to see that business is, and the trust level of business has gone to a high in the barometer, and that of the four categories, government is at the lowest, even lower than media, which is really surprising.
Maybe some of your success stories should be more widely known.
As a life, if some of you don't know, I spent my career as a journalist before I came to the Atlantic.
Because how do you market successfully that public education is actually has improved how do you communicate that effectively into the wider population?
It's a communications question, or is it a performance question?
Probably a mixture of both.
I think it's a mixture. I think it is. We've had a climate for some time where bashing the government is a path to power. I was with some of our intel and defense entities earlier today, and one of the questions that comes up constantly, how do you expect us to keep working when we are basically vilified day in and day out in a financially stressed environment in a country that's got $18.5 trillion of debt right now? We're going to always be asking our public employees to do more with less. It's just not a good management technique to spend all your day bashing that workforce, number one. Number two, I do think there are more things around transparency that government has not been very good about transparency. We can, should, and must be better. Three, I think we've had the challenge of as particular political forces, let me just speak to the United States, as members of Congress who are willing to be bipartisan, the very fact that they're being bipartisan is used as a reason to be primaried against, that gets rid of the center and reinforces the extremes.
Right.
And those extremes generally are people who are pointing out the challenges with government. So it becomes a bit, again, of self-fulfilling prophecy. I think there is incredible opportunities.
Maybe, Senator, and I shouldn't say this, I'm not yet an American citizen, but I'm on my pathway. And
Good.
I don't want to burn my but my observation.
Take a risk.
I take the risk. I think this government bashing has swapped all over the world, by the way. It's the same is everywhere, as the trust barometer has shown. And behind it is, of course, an extreme polarization, and there are many historical reasons for that. And so the consensus ability in the middle is just disintegrating. And now with many people becoming even more populist and tribal in their approach, it's seemingly becoming ever more difficult. But maybe one way to start turning around is just asking the right questions again. So what does it take to make public institutions effective? I remember here 15 years ago in this great country, this was the main lead theme of parties who were competing for the popular vote, presenting credible programs, what they would do. What does it take? Now these questions are even asked anymore. What does it take to make public service effective again? Maybe we should ask this question.
I think we need that. I also think there are, let me give you a couple of the bright spot opportunities. We have, I'm a baby boomer. I'm yesterday's news. The millennials now are the largest age cohort in America. Within 5 years, they'll be half the workforce. They generally are more optimistic and do want to buy from, work for, and engage with socially responsible companies. That's a great opportunity. Most of us in politics, too many of us in politics, are still framing the argument as liberal conservative, left right, when more and more of the arguments ought to be future past.
Right.
We are living in a world that the acceleration of technology growth, of artificial intelligence, globalization, all these factors which have they have upsides and downsides, every one of them. I have to tell you, I've spent a lot of time over the last 10 months looking at this so-called gig and on-demand economy. As a policymaker, I don't think I've fully appreciated how much people will do to get flexibility over their own lives. That's great. But we also need to recognize that the traditional social contract and social insurance, unemployment, workman's comp, disability, retirement, we've got to define what that new social contract ought to look like. That's a future past argument, not a left-right argument. If there are areas around where Richard has talked about, if there is this opportunity with business to play a more engaged role, and I think there are a number of responsible businesses, but there are still many from both the business side and from the investor side who say, gosh, I'd like to do more, but I've got ERISA fiduciary duty obligations, or I've got corporate governance obligations, or I've got no inability to have differential voting powers based upon the length of time you own a share. Well, those are all within the power of government to not radically restructure, but slightly to tweak to reinforce long-term value creation. I mean, I would even argue that one of the things that's been totally turned on its head is I grew up, I think we both grew up in a time when, Econ 101 was, we have an abundance of labor and we have a shortage of capital, so we have to do all we can to promote aggregation of capital. And our tax code and many of our policies are all built around that thesis. But in the last 25 or 30 years, at least in North America and for much of the West, we have plenty of capital, but we have shortage of qualified labor. So if we have two $10 million companies or $100 million companies, and I don't care what the area, not just technology, and one's got 100 employees and one's got 1,000 employees, the company with 1,000 employees is going to pay a tax rate 8 to 10 points higher than the company with 100 employees because of all of the incentives we've given around capital. Well, how do we reshift within the framework of democratic capitalism incentives to make investing in people and training a little higher on the value chart? These are all possible things, and they actually, could redefine part of the political argument away from kind of what is, for the most part, fairly tired 20th century arguments that if we could reframe some of this, I actually think, and then produce a product, I think there's an opportunity to re-engage the American people, and I'm can only speak here domestically, in a way that Americans are genuinely optimistic people.
Yeah, no, Senator,
Richard, let me turn to Richard on this, and then we'll go to the audience. So that's pretty troubling trust gap. You've never seen it that big before.
No.
What's the danger in that, number one? And then why aren't more people laying the blame for inequality at business door? It seems like there's more trust in business. So much as I hear Senator Warren say, gosh, that's a great idea for government, it almost looks as though people are not looking to government for the solution right now, or at least they don't trust. Maybe they're looking to, but they don't trust it. So I guess the three questions that grow out of this is, what's the danger in that gap? What's the lesson and message for business? What's the lesson and message for government?
So the danger, it seems to me, is one, populism, which is going to block trade, block immigration, block acceptance of innovation. That in fact, you're going to see more examples of overreaction because people are scared of job loss. And in that context, there's a demand for government to get tough. And so, whether or not you love Uber, the people of Frankfurt, Germany have no option now. It's gone. Hamburg too. And that's just example.
Though Uber is a German word, after all. But
yes.
Yeah.
But less and less a German service.
Yes.
And so the second thing is, should business worry about this? Yes. What can business do about it? Well, it seems to me that in a time where there's a leadership void, which is definitely perceived, for the last 7 years, I think the lesson that CEOs have taken is it's a hell of a lot less risky just to stay in the office, do the work, go out and see the investors, and that's that. That's what we're supposed to do. One, because if you're in financial services, particularly, you wanted to stay away from government. You wanted to not have any more beatings in the, Senate Finance Committee. Not you, but some of your colleagues. And then the second is they're activist investors. Ackman and Icon, and so you're supposed to be in the office if you're Irene Rosenfeld and work like hell and split the company because that's the right idea, and get Mondelez over here and Kraft over here, and all the investors are happy, and now she's in trouble again. But that's the activists. So just keep your head down and just do your work. Well, I think that in the last year and a half, I think that Georg's correct. A lot of CEOs have actually stuck their heads up and started with sustainability. Started with Walmart, Unilever, GE, saying, we can actually have green equals green. And I think that was starting to become accepted. and some companies were very active in supporting COP21, and they've made commitments on certain kinds of energy they're going to buy. Then I think there's a sort of second level of CEOs getting active on employment issues, having to do with the coalition of American companies The 100,000 Jobs campaign that was announced over the summer in Chicago, Starbucks started it, but Hilton's in it and a bunch of others. And they're committing to employ unemployed youth and train them and get them in, and they have job fairs, and there's a job fair in Los Angeles in early November, there's one in Chicago, and this is, so unemployment. Then I start to see also companies becoming involved on social issues. And some of it was this, revulsion against the law in Indiana, where certain companies, Salesforce, Apple, said, we're not going to do any conventions anymore in Indiana. We're done. And then the governor had to retreat because there was big pressure from business. So I think all of that is significant. Now, what can and what has...
You would agree that the reason the business numbers have gone up is Georg's reason, or what's your analysis of why there's more confidence in business now?
I think there's more confidence in business because unemployment has dropped. At least through November 1st, when we finished the survey, there wasn't the...
Globally.
Yes, there wasn't the decline in the stock markets. And business is seen as having provided that recovery. It's not seen as a government-led recovery. It's seen as a business recovery. It's seen as, tech or, small business or, of the like. Mm-hmm. Business gets the credit. Government may have provided the financing, but business gets the credit for it.
And the message in this for government, in your report for government?
I think some part of, how business gets credit now for sustainability through its reporting. Some aspect of transparency and saying, here's where we're going to go, and here's reports. But I think also a little bit more of, even if the business has to make a short-term, quarterly profit, I think there's sort of a longer-term planning horizon that business is held accountable for. And you may disagree with that, because you've been both sides.
No, I think capitalism over the right time horizon works.
Yeah.
There's a question is what the right time horizon on some of these investments, particularly when you talk to human capital.
Yeah.
And I think there are outlier companies who've done well, and I agree. But I think we can't deny the fact that 60% of Americans couldn't absorb an unexpected $400 bill without turning to a family member going bankrupt. I mean, that's a level of insecurity that's been basically unprecedented. Now, there are tools and income smoothing and other things that we could use, but we gotta recognize that. We also got to recognize some of the companies that you've mentioned, and I applaud what they've done, but some of the companies who've actually increased, not some of the ones you mentioned, a couple others who've increased their base pay for folks, I applaud that. But then you press and you say, well, what did you do to your cafeteria workers and your janitorial staff? Well, they were all non-core functions that were outsourced in the 90s. So how we make this good behavior incented throughout the whole economic structure is, I think, what we've got to grapple with. And I've been looking at some ideas on optional corporate forms or other incentives that we might put in place. It wouldn't force all this behavior, but as I think we've seen the sustainability indexes, if you can get the ball rolling a little faster, combine that with the presence of millennials who I think hopefully will vote with their pocketbook in terms of responsible companies, in terms of who they buy from, we could see an acceleration. But I think this is not something that too often companies say, well, if we can go back and reform K-12, yes, we need to reform K-12, but I don't think we have 20 years to get this reform right.
I mean, Fred, as an example, in Davos, the guy who runs PayPal said that there are 2 billion people without financial services. 2 billion people have no access. That in fact, when they do, they pay more for that than they do for food because of the level of risk. And he said, look, that's unconscionable. And I am going to help lead here on access. And I'm going to talk to the cell phone companies, and I'm going to have PayPal be available.
The mobile telephone.
Which is the device, but then it has to link up with PayPal or other.
If you think about, again, what is the most, as somebody who is the co-founder of Nextel, did pretty well in the cell phone business, but one of the most fastest growing expenses outside of rent and food for 40, 50% of Americans, their cell phone bill. Well, you know, we can think about why couldn't we create a plan that says if you've got, for every 12 months of being a customer, you're going to get a month free at some point to be used when stuff happens in your life. I mean, there's a whole new series of kind of social insurance or related insurance products that may not fall into the classic unemployment, disability, workman's comp. How do we reimagine those in a 21st century way? And I think
Mark, what we're talking about is a fundamentally different role for a business leader, which has never been to conceptualize markets. It's always been to sell products. And so that's the difference between management and leadership. And I think the next phase is people who can realize, like Paul Pullman understands that on sustainability, we'll never get to the COP21 goals just by companies changing their supply chain. You have to change consumer behavior. 2/3 of what Unilever has to do is persuade people to take shorter showers and use cold water wash. I know it sounds simple, but that's a big change. It's behavior change.
Your activist investor is not going to see much mileage in that either. But let's go. We've got a little bit of time left. Harlan Ullman, and please, even though I announced you, you can announce yourself
Thanks.
too, and to whom you'd like to.
I'm
place
Harlan
it.
Ullman with the Atlantic Council. Fred, this is a fascinating discussion. I wish we had more time. My question or really statement is for Richard. I was struck with two of your findings that I found really quite extraordinary. First, I think that government has been overvalued in terms of its trust, the way that you have presented it. But second, and more importantly, among the elite, I'm astounded to think that there's a level of trust in government in the United States that you seem to represent. I would say among my circle, limited, I would say that 90% are very much opposed to what's happening in government, Republican or Democrat, makes no difference. You have the extraordinary presidential campaigns with Trump and Sanders that reflect that. And so I'm just curious as to how you, in the United States, your findings about the elite, because I would have thought the elite would be far more cynical about the trustworthiness of government than the remaining 85%. I wonder if you could comment on that.
I think, and remember, we're not talking federal, state, it's just government. Government's been fairly benign. It may have been not the most competent, but it stays out of my way. I can make money, and I'm making a lot of money.
And I think your point is a good one too, because I think you don't differentiate between state and federal government or between Congress and the Pentagon. I mean, there might be differences in that as well. I don't know.
I mean, there's not more to say. I mean,
Please.
They're doing okay.
Question.
Out of my way.
Don Bork, former director of the National League of Cities. Could you disaggregate on that very subject you just mentioned between the trust levels between federal government, state government, and local government? Over the years, local government has had a far higher level of trust, but it's still very low. And I wonder, in the work that you've done, can you see any differentiation, not only in this country, but in other countries as well?
We don't ask that question, so I can't, but I can certainly tell you that I'm in Chicago a lot, and it's not a very good story locally.
But I can tell you, from a Virginia standpoint, usually the difference was about 20 points, if my memory serves, between Virginians' view of the direction of Virginia versus the direction of the country.
I see.
So I think that, part of
Tells
it's
you
just
a lot.
the entity that's closer to people in terms of actually delivering services. And candidly, there are exceptions, but where it doesn't seem to be, whatever legislative entity isn't involved in a 365-day-a-year food fight, tarnishes a little bit of where I work.
Trust is definitely performance related.
Yeah, maybe one additional perspective. Globally speaking, what I've seen, at least in my work, is that local governments have actually increased in terms of creativity and innovation, and the whole delegation of authority has moved much more downward. So your inversion also is partially reflected already in actual governance setups. And cities, in many ways, are now leaders in many of the issue areas, far ahead of federal solutions in many places around the world.
Thank you. Please, I saw a question.
Hi.
Yeah,
yes, my name's Janice Walt-Grenadier, and I actually live in Virginia. And trust is a real problem in our country right now. In fact, any time of accountability, when we have a government, elected officials, and all policing themselves, especially our judiciary. October 11th, 2014, the Virginia Pilot and Washington Post reported that Mark Warner had was in the process of trading a federal judgeship in Virginia for Legislature Pinkett. On October 14th, 2014, I reported this on my blog. On October 22nd, 2014, I was illegally jailed and tortured in the city of Alexandria till 5 p.m. on Election Day, 14 days in solitary confinement. So I could not disclose the emails between myself and Mark Warner's office on the corruption in the judiciary in Virginia. On January 2015, the Virginia RNC...
Yeah, excuse me.
It's events, but you shouldn't be making a speech.
Yeah,
You have a question?
Yes,
You
I do have a question.
Then ask the question.
Do you believe that part of the reason, or part of the reason Bernie and Donald Trump are ahead of the game is because we all feel that we will have a chance of accountability and that somebody will have to be held accountable by the government, elected officials, when we make a complaint, when there is a complaint filed?
Do you want me to answer that, or do you want to answer
I have
it?
no idea what, I mean, I know the one issue that she raised, it was a political issue where there was no basis. And on the circumstance of her personal issue, I have no idea what she's talking about.
Yep.
Okay, but, okay.
Well, let's go to the next question, please.
Here.
Hello, Eleanor Backrack. Just a couple of points. One is that smaller point is that actually it appeared that your graphs showed trust in government going up in the most recent polls, not totally trending down. Second, it seems to me that a lot of this, your findings, at least for the U.S., are somewhat attributable to your excellent profession. Businesses get complimented by both business and politicians, and business and politicians both beat up on, and in case of politicians, often obstruct government. Businesses also often count on government programs to make up for shortcomings in what they pay their lower workers. So my question is, has this gone too far? Have we had so much fun with bashing government? I think in many ways, as you said, self-fulfilling prophecy, or is it that they really are bad?
I think it's a good question, and this could also circle us back to the role of media as well. So let's, who would like to take this question on, and also, Richard, a little bit. We haven't talked about media. Yep.
I get fairly disgusted with folks who spend their time in politics saying completely only what's wrong with our country. And there are a number of those. I think there are times where folks, it is, and I was very lucky to do very well in business, and it becomes a cocktail pastime to say, let's talk about all the things that government isn't getting right, amongst, and I would agree, Harlan, amongst the elites and amongst the masses. The fact of the matter is, though, our public school system is improving. Our graduation rates are going up. NIH and the remarkable things that have taken place in healthcare research is because of public investments. We live in a very dangerous world, and our military and intel perform very well. So I do think this has become, over the top. I'm not sure how you put the genie back in the bottle. I do think it is a challenge when, when people of both parties actually try to work together. That becomes fodder for the extremes on both sides criticizing rather than reinforcing. I actually believe in our country, most things that have moved the country forward have come with some kind of, have been more policy driven in the middle than in the extremes. And we have a system right now that is harder to make that happen. But I think your underlying point is a pretty darn good one.
On media.
On media, I think it's quite fundamental that millennials do not go direct to media. They go to that which is referred by their friends. And the result of this is that, in fact, those that are sort of born digital media, so Quartz or Business Insider, Quartz gets 97% of its traffic from social. 97%. So inherently, this cycle or the circle means you want to be short enough and fun enough to be referred by friends, and the same goes for BuzzFeed and Vice and others. But it changes the character of media. It's not the Wall Street Journal that you had all that time at. I mean, it's different. Your friend Kevin Delaney has come up with a very good model for Quartz.
Absolutely.
But it's short form, a lot of graphics, links to other people's stuff. You're an aggregator as opposed to an originator. It's just a different business.
Absolutely. And
shorter staff, 8 stories a day.
Very few
8
people
stories a day.
And very few people come to you through your homepage or through your front page.
3-paragraph stories.
Yeah.
Or his other theory is it's a bell curve. No middle, long pieces, few, and lots of short.
Last question, Richard, about the survey, and then we'll break up. It's fascinating reading. You have to go on to the site, Edelman site. Maybe you'll allow us to post it as well on the Atlantic Council site. But the global question. We're talking in broad terms. I've noticed that Latin American countries had notably high levels of trust in the businesses they work for, far above the global average. So that's sort of interesting. As you look at your report, pick out 1 or 2 of the things that are sort of region-specific or country-specific that you felt stood out the most.
I think the consistent and continuous reliance on and high trust in government in China, UAE, India. That's a sort of newer phenomenon from Modi, Singapore. So government.
Elites and mass.
Everybody.
Yeah.
So government can do it. The point is it exists. The mode of government is another question, but that it can is there. Second, I find that the rise in trust in CEOs to be kind of amazing. After so many years after 2008 of terrible, just this sort of ascent again. It's not everywhere, still low in Germany, for instance, but because of Deutsche Bank and a few other problems this year.
Do you think that is a reflection of all CEOs, or do you think it was because the people that are identified as CEOs are in the tech space and it's disproportionately, they're viewed as more kind of forward-leaning than most traditional business?
I think the fact of the tech CEOs has allowed people to believe in the class of CEOs. But those individuals are driving it forward. And now it's going to take another push to get it to work. And then I guess the third thing, Fred, is just the degree of skepticism in the world where, you still have to see a thing 5 times before you believe it. You have to read a piece 5 times. It used to be twice before 2008. So people are still skeptical. And they also have total short-term attention spans. They basically tell us they read a piece for a minute. Next. It's an impression world, right? It's a world of impressions.
Yeah.
And we'll know a lot more, I guess, in a couple hours.
We will know a lot more in a couple hours. We have no crystal ball. We have no early returns. The caucuses are only, really, they're only going to be convening at 7 o'clock Iowa time, so 8 o'clock here. But, I could say in closing that if Donald Trump did not have early access to your barometer, he certainly has used it as something of a roadmap. And both in terms of using his credibility as a business leader and using the lack of credibility of politics, it's quite interesting to see how this plays out.
And the demise of advertising. In other words,
right.
he has spent $2 million in total. That's it. It's not an advertising. You can't buy it now. It has to be, in a sense, earned by peer-to-peer.
Yeah.
Who would have thought Donald Trump would have been the genesis behind campaign finance reform?
Well, that's tweetable. I think we may want to close on that. But thank you all for coming. Thank you very much to Senator Warner, to Georg, and to Richard.